Hey guys, Katie here from I'm Loud Productions. Welcome to this workshop on erasure poetry. This is a form of poetry also known as cutout poetry or blackout poetry, in which you start with some text and then you slowly erase, cut out, or black out different sections of the text, leaving you with a poem. Great form of poetry for wherever your level of experience is. It's really fun and particularly good if you're experiencing some writer's block and you don't want to sort of start out having to stare at a blank page and get out your own ideas, and instead you want to whittle away something else. So in this workshop, I'm going to be teaching you, first of all, what the form of poetry is, and then I'm going to show you some techniques for creating it, including some digital techniques, which I'm really excited about. So in this workshop, I'm going to start out by explaining what erasure poetry is and talk a little bit about the different ways in which it can be created. And then I'm actually going to give you some exercises for creating your own. So at this point, you can pause the video and then go work on it, come back to the video, see the next step, work on it more, or you can just watch the video all the way through for a general how-to guide on how to create this poetry and then do it in your own time, whatever works best for you. So what do you need for this workshop? I'm going to be talking you through two different ways of creating erasure poetry. So the traditional way of doing it is with a physical text, like a book or a newspaper, and a Sharpie to black it out. So you can do it that way and use those materials. I'm also going to be talking you through a digital way of doing it, where you would just need your computer, smartphone, or tablet. So either one of those techniques, if you just gather materials for either one, you will be all set. So before we begin, just a short plug. If you enjoy this workshop, if you want to see more of them, this is just a sneak peek of the workshops that we're going to be offering on our Patreon channel. The community tier patrons that support us there are going to get lots of workshops just like this one that are specifically tailored to what they want. They won't all be recorded workshops like this either. Some of them will be live Zoom workshops in which participants will get feedback. So if you want more of these, including different styles of workshops, if you want the opportunity to tailor them, and if you want the other amazing perks that we offer on Patreon, like early access to our work, exclusive content, on-demand content, then please do sign up to support us. I put the link below. It is helping to keep us afloat right now, and it really would mean a lot. All right, so what is erasure poetry? As I said before, it is a type of poetry in which you don't actually technically write a poem. Instead, you start with a bit of text and then you erase, cut out, or black out other bits of text until you are left with a poem. There's a lot of amazing creative ways of doing that, and I've linked to some of them below. You can, if you're doing it with a physical text, like a newspaper or a book, you can paint over different words. You can put objects over them. You can physically cut them out with an X-Acto knife. There are a lot of different ways of going about it. And erasure poetry is technically a style of found poetry, because rather than writing the poem, you are finding the poem within something else. Found poetry is really exciting and also a really sort of accessible, democratic form of poetry. It's a way of seeing poetry and everything. So definitely something to play around with in your poetic practice. So for an example of erasure poetry, check out our return to form video, which I am linking just up there in that corner. In it, Mark Galley and I both took the same bit of text and created erasure poems from it. And they turned out quite different, which is really exciting. And I'm going to be using that same bit of text for the workshop today. So it's the first section of H.G. Wells's classic novel, The War of the Worlds, which came out around the turn of the 20th century. So do go watch that, pause this video, go check that out, and then that'll give you a good sense of what erasure poetry is. All right, so you know what erasure poetry is, you've seen an example of it. What's the first step in creating it? Probably quite obviously, it's finding your starting text. So Obviously, what we did in the return to form videos was we used a piece of literature, but you absolutely don't have to do that. The really exciting thing about Erasure Poetry is that you can use literally anything. So you can use a newspaper article or a section of a newspaper article. You can use a paragraph from a novel or a nonfiction book. You could use a biography. You could use the back of a cereal box. Really, any bit of writing is perfect for creating an erasure poem. If you want to use a work of literature to create your erasure poem and you are planning on publishing it or otherwise sharing it, I would highly encourage you to consider using work that is no longer under copyright. You might be able to get away with publishing a piece of erasure poetry off of a novel or a poem or something that is under copyright under fair use laws, but I am not a lawyer and it would depend on what your publisher says. So I would really highly encourage you to use work that is now in the public domain. Below, I have linked to this amazing site called Project Gutenberg, which has tons and tons of literature, which is fully in the public domain. All of the ebooks are free to download, so do go check them out. War of the Worlds, which we're using today as an example, is included in Project Gutenberg, as are many, many classic novels like Frankenstein and Alice in Wonderland. So lots of goodness to check out there. If you want to create your erasure poem using an actual book, but you're a little squirmy about the idea of defacing literature, the first thing I would say is rather than thinking of it as defacing the literature, think of it as evolving it, transforming it. But yeah, I maybe would suggest not using your favorite rare book copy of your favorite novel. Try going to an old bookstore. Sometimes libraries have books that they're getting rid of. Get something that's already maybe a little bit dog-eared, and then you'll really feel comfortable going to town on this book. So today, as an example throughout the workshop, I'm going to be using the first paragraph of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, just like we did in the Return to Form video. If you would like to follow along and use that same piece of example text, I put a Dropbox link below where you can download it. Or if you'd prefer to create an erasure poem out of your own materials, just pause the video here, go find something that you're interested, and then join us once you have it. So in the workshop today, I'm going to mainly be showing you on a digital device how to create erasure poetry, because that's the style that I personally prefer, that I find easiest. But before I do that, I'm just going to sort of talk about the strategy of how to do it with a physical piece of text. Ultimately, the key principles are the same. My main piece of advice, if you are going to create an erasure poem from a physical document, like a book or a newspaper, is to photocopy it first, or take a photo of it first. Because if you Sharpie something out, or you otherwise feel like you've made a mistake, you can't go back from that. So this way you have a backup in case you want to start again. In the same vein, if you are working from a physical document, I would really highly recommend that rather than just going in there with a Sharpie and starting with crossing things out in a permanent way, you instead start by circling things and not actually make any permanent changes to the text until the very end. So I'll talk you through that even when I'm doing the digital stuff. But my main piece of advice would be, don't make it permanent until you are perfectly happy with it, particularly since with a physical text, you only really get one shot. All right, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of how to actually create an erasure poem. So like I said, I'm going to be showing you the way that I do it digitally. And the reason why I prefer doing it digitally is because I get really scared of anything being set in stone. So I really like how when you're creating erasure poetry on a digital device, it's really easy to save multiple copies so that you can see different iterations of the poem before you settle on the version that you like the most. So to make an erasure poem digitally, you need to use either your computer, a tablet, or your phone. And I'll talk you through the software that I use, but really all that you need is some sort of photo editing software that just lets you color over an image. So you could do this on Instagram, for example. So when I'm creating erasure poetry on a digital device, I use an app called Udoodle, which is free. It occasionally gives you ads, but it is super easy to use. So I will link to how to download it below, and I'm going to show you a screen recording of how I make these on my iPad. So this is Udoodle. This is the basic page. And the first thing that I do is I go to File and Import, and you're going to want to draw on top of a photo. So I'm now just going to hit load from sketchbook because that's where I've already saved this, but you can also import it from your camera roll. And that is how you bring up the image. So once you have the image up, it might ask you to crop it. Just go for whatever makes the most sense until you have the image on your screen. Okay, now that you have your text loaded in your digital device or you're looking at it on the page, the next step from there is just to read it a bunch and really, really make yourself familiar with the bit of text that you're looking at. And it's an interesting sort of reading that you have to do because you're not really reading for meaning, but you want to sort of dissociate from what the text in front of you is saying and instead look at it for the words in it, for the phrases in it. You know, you're sort of trying to see the trees instead of the forest, if that makes sense. Because ultimately, you know, you're not trying to understand what the text is saying. You're trying to totally transform the text by removing key elements of it. So take a minute now, pause this video and read through this text that you have at least twice, maybe more, until you really feel like you know it inside out. So the next step, once you've read your piece and you really feel like you know it, is to go through and just circle some words that you really like or that jump out at you for whatever reason. As I was saying before, you know, some people start erasure poems by just blacking things out or cutting things out. I like to do the inverse approach, where instead of starting by cutting things out, I start by highlighting things that I want to keep in. Because I think that way I just find it a lot easier when I can still see everything that's there, but I've highlighted the bits that I might want to join together. And it's also easier just so that you're not starting by Xing things out that you might want to then use later. So the way that I do this in UDoodle is I go to the brush icon. You can pick whatever highlighting you use. I use sort of a 50% opaque yellow. So I like that. Okie dokie. And then I'm going to go through and what do I like? I really like the word mortal there. I find that interesting. To and fro over the globe has a really nice ring to it. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to, just find bits that jump out at me for whatever reason. At this point, pause the video, go through your text and circle or highlight things that you really like. All right, so now you've gone through your text and you've circled some words that you find interesting or exciting. I want you just to take a minute, look back through those words and try to think about connections. Is there a connection between these phrases, between these ideas? Is there anything there? So just pause the video, take a little bit of time, look through the text. What sort of relationships are there between the things that you've highlighted that you might not have noticed before? Awesome. So one thing that's really important to keep in mind with erasure poetry, the temptation is always, you know, just to use the really shiny, exciting words and phrases. And obviously that is a great way of doing it. You know, that's sort of the way that I've encouraged you to begin. But if you want to create a narrative or really create any sort of poem that will make grammatical sense or be a sentence, you know, you're going to need the little words. You're going to need the ands and the tos and the thes. So at this point, you know, if you have a sentence starting to form or an idea or an argument, go back through again and see what little words do you need? Are they in there? Because you can't add anything. So if they're not already in there, you know, maybe you might need to adjust your idea. So take a little bit of time, see if you have a sentence forming. If not, we'll come back to that and we'll sort of address the different routes that you can go. So pause here, see what you've got, see what sort of direction you maybe want to be thinking about taking it. All right, so at this point you have some things circled or highlighted. You maybe have some ideas for directions that this could go. So I just want to talk about some of the different philosophies behind erasure poetry and some of the different ways that you can go about doing it. So first of all, it is entirely up to you how much of the source material you actually use. So you could cut out everything except for a single word for example. I mean, it'd be a very short poem, but you could cut out the grand majority of the source text, or conversely, you could only cut out a very small amount. Maybe just removing all of the negatives, all of the nots to make a negative into a positive thing would be a really interesting approach. So totally up to you how much you remove and how much you leave in. You also have total control over whether you decide to reinforce or emphasize what the original source material is saying, or whether you decide to undermine it or undercut it or make some other more provocative statement about it. So as an example of this, one of my favorite Erasure poems is Tracy K. Smith's poem Declaration, and I've linked it below. And she uses the Declaration of Independence as her source material. So political statements and documents are a really, really interesting way of going about this. And what she does is she creates, out of a poem which is all about freedom and independence, a piece which, although it never mentions the word slavery, is very much about slavery and about how the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence were complicit, and not just complicit, active in enforcing slavery. So in their real hypocrisy about that. And she does that just using the words of the Declaration of Independence. So it's an incredibly profound, powerful piece. And so, yeah, you have options here, what sort of relationship you want to have with the source material, whether it is reinforcing or whether it is undermining or provoking in some way. So another example of that, if you watched our return to form video up there, the approach that I ended up taking was not so much to undermine the War of the Worlds, but to update it sort of for our current situation. So I was reading this text, which was about, cataclysmic change and planets and about the sun and heat and temperature and all of this. And all that I could think about was climate change. So eventually, I already had these words about danger, about mortality, about heat, about the sun. And I just went, okay, how can I use this material and actually take a, over a century-old poem and make it about something that wasn't a clear and present danger at that time, but very much is now. So that is another approach, another way of going about it, is bringing out a narrative that was not present in the original text whatsoever. Just sort of on the technical and the grammar side, one of the really fun things about Erasure Poetry is that you don't have to worry about punctuation. You don't have to worry about capitalization because you are just using what is in there. So if you want to, you could, leave some commas, you could leave some periods, try to make sure that everything is correct, but it's not really something that you need to worry about. You can also get really creative and imaginative. If you have the word can't, but you want the word can, just erase the apostrophe T. You can use halves of words. Really, the sky is the limit in terms of how you go about creating this poem and how you transform the source material. So when I wrote this Erasure poem for the Return to Form videos, I went through a lot of different drafts and I kept trying out different things, different combinations. And the reason why, as I said before, I really like digital devices is it is super, super easy to save. So I would just take screenshots anytime I was happy with something so that later I had a reference that I could then go back to and say, actually, I prefer this version. It was very, very easy for me to try out different iterations of the poem without anything being destroyed or mucked up in any way. So to talk you through logistically how I ended up doing this poem. So again, I really wanted to make it about climate change. And so I sort of discovered a narrative, and this took me many, many drafts, which I'm not going to fully go into here and show you all of. But the way that I went about doing it, again, first I started by highlighting everything. So I had this. So anything that I decide that I don't actually want, I will then erase that. So impossible, I didn't end up using. There we go. Envious eyes, I also did not end up using. So at the end of the process, I ended up with this. I had this poem that was highlighted and I could very clearly see the poem that way. So the next step was just to essentially inverse it, and rather than highlighting the bits that I wanted to keep in, to black out the bits that I wanted to keep out. So I'll show you how I went about doing that. So essentially what I did is I used the brush, but I just changed it so that it was black at about, I believe I use about 70% opaque. That keeps it easy. And the reason why I don't do a full blackout, at least at this point, is I actually really like seeing what the other options are. And for me personally, when I'm reading erasure poetry, I kind of like to see what's under the bits that have been blacked out. So that's why I use 70%. So I hit done. And then I just go through and I do the inverse. So I'm going to X out that. And you'll see I'm not maybe as precise as I could be, but I just go through and I X out everything that I'm not using. And again, there is time later to clean this up. There is time to go back through and make it pretty. At this point, I'm just trying to get a sense of what it is going to look like in the end. So at this point, I realize, oops, I've made a mistake. I actually crossed out something that I really wanted to leave in. Super, super easy. All I do, and just go to the erase button. I realize that I need as impossible in there, so I just X it out. And that's why I like doing it on a digital device. Just makes it loads simpler. So now what I can do is I can go through and I can read it. No one believed that this world, oh, there's another place where I need to change it. No one believed that this world was keenly and closely mortal. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe, serene in their empire over matter. No one gave a thought to the danger, the idea of life as impossible, of this earth against us. So at this point, I'm happy. I have my poem. I'm feeling good about it. At this point, I can then properly go in and I can clean it up. And so what that might mean for me here is, first of all, I want to take a screenshot, so I can do that. I now know what it looks like, so I have a record of it if I mess up or I want to start again or whatever the case may be. But now basically it's up to you. So you can really get creative with the ways that you cut out, black out, or erase your source material. So you might want to do a really beautiful painting over it, whether that's a digital painting or an actual, watercolor or other style of painting over a piece of paper or over a newspaper or book page. You could do something really cool with stamps or with images, with a collage. There's so many different ways of going about it. And with different sorts of software, with different, you could do this in Photoshop, again, with Instagram, any number of different things. You're going to find different creative ways of going about it. If you search on Instagram, #blackout poetry, it is incredible the creativity that people have with the way that they go about it. So at this point, it's really great to be able to consider what sort of way of displaying this material is going to best fit the material itself. What will best reinforce the sort of idea or message that I am bringing about here. So now at this point, what I might decide to do is say, okay, actually, I want it to really be a true blackout poem. So I'm going to take, the full black, and I'm just going to really go over all of those sections and properly do it. And, you could fill in that space. You could do all of that. So now look at my poem. It obviously looks like a bit of a mess. It's sloppy. I don't really want to publish it that way. So if I'm going to want to publish this, I could go back into the brush and I could use just the full opacity of black, and I could cover it like that. Another option is I could then also just do I could white out things rather than blacking them out, which would then just create this really interesting effect that only that text was ever there, which I think looks really nice. You know, the fun thing about digital devices is you can, you know, do really, really quirky stuff with it, you know, get in there with different patterns, and really just go to town. So just the thing to remember here is to have fun with it, to be creative, but also that there are a lot of different opportunities for the way in which you illustrate, the way in which you cut out the poem or do a painting over it or, you know, black it out or whatever, for that to really reinforce or underline or accentuate the poem itself that you have created. There's a lot of really beautiful stuff that you can do around that. So for instance, with my poem, I could do an illustration over it showing, you know, some of the effects of climate change. That would be quite powerful. There's any number of things. Just get experimental in there and have fun. So I think I like it just with the white background. So basically what I'm doing is going in there with a brush and just brushing everything that is in the background to white. I then go over it with the eraser tool so that I can erase all of the yellow highlights. And then I go back over it with the brush and I make it a little bit smaller so that I can get in there with more precision and make it exactly how I want it to be with quite a lot of detail. So this part can take a little while if you're quite detail oriented, but ultimately it ends up looking really clean and smooth and lovely, and you have total control over how the final product comes out. The final step, obviously, once you have finished on your digital device, is just to save it. So you can either take a screenshot or you can go to File, Save, and you can save it to your camera roll, and then it'll just be in there. And you'll have a great record of it. So that is how to create an erasure poem using a digital device. As I said before, if you're going to be using a bit of physical text in order to do it, like a newspaper or a book, it's the exact same artistic process. You just want to use a pencil to circle things first. Or you can use a highlighter, although obviously that's a lot more permanent. I would just recommend that you save using a Sharpie to black things out until the very end when you're happy with the poem and that you take a photo before you begin. And that's us. Thank you so much for joining us for this workshop today. I hope that you had fun. I hope you learned something about creating erasure poetry. Please do follow some of the links below where I link to different examples of erasure poetry. Please also search for #Blackout Poetry on Instagram. There is this absolutely amazing community of creators putting out really incredible, inventive work, both using the physical and digital techniques, which is really, really exciting. If you liked this video, if you learned something from it, please hit like and hit subscribe. Please comment below with some examples of your poetry. Link us to them. We would love to see them. And if you want to see more of these workshops, if you want to keep learning about different styles of poetry and get some insight into how we do this, and if you want to be able to tailor future workshops to your own interests, please do consider joining us on Patreon. It would mean the world, particularly in this moment, and give us some much needed support to keep putting work out there. So thank you guys again. Hope you have an awesome day and happy writing.